we're going to talk about, this is the last lesson in Module 2. So you'll have some vocabulary quiz coming at you on Monday, test on Wednesday. So Module 2, Lesson 5 is on the dynasties in China. Now, we're talking about a new area of the world. And so the first thing we always have to talk about is what? It's geography. Where in the world is it? Okay? So as you can see by the world map on the bottom, China is a large yellow country here. It's not really yellow, but it's this country right here in the continent of Asia. Geographically, it's pretty large. As you can see, it's rough. It's a little. It's very similar to the size of the United States. So it's a very large country geographically. All right. This is up here is a physical map that shows some of the rivers and mountains and the oceans and seas that comprise the geography of China. Now, we're talking about ancient China. And like all other ancient civilizations, the civilization in China began around what geographic feature? Like all ancient civilizations, river valleys. And ancient China has, and present day China, they have more than 2 rivers, but there are 2 main rivers where civilizations sprang up around China. The Yangtze River, as you can see, it flows all the way to the ocean and meets the ocean in present-day Shanghai, one of the largest cities in the world, population-wise. And the Huanghe, which is also known as the Yellow River. Okay? Huanghe. Also, you can just call it the Yellow River. Okay? Yangtze, Huanghe. So we said the Huanghe we call it the Yellow River. Why might you think it's called the Yellow River? There is some yellow coloration, and that yellow coloration comes because whenever this river floods, as you can see, it shows an expansion and contraction of the river valleys as flooding occurs. And as the Yellow River recedes, it leaves a deposit of silt on the riverbank. But the riverbank, the silt that is in the Yellow River is yellow. And so it leaves this yellow silt on the riverbanks, and then it makes the water appear to be yellow. Obviously, the water is not yellow. It just appears to be yellow because the silt is yellow. And if you take a look, this is kind of what that silt looks like. It has a yellowish tint to it. Just a very slight tint. Okay? But that's the Yellow River. That's the Yellow River. So the way that this river, this yellow silt gets on the riverbanks, and then the winds pick it up and it blows it all throughout deserts and all throughout the plains of China, mountains. And when that silt, that very fertile silt gets blown around, it gets a name. It's called loess. Loess. And you say it just like Peter Griffin's wife. Loess. 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 All right, so Yellow River, it floods. It leaves silt behind. That silt gets picked up by the wind and blown all throughout the banks and plains and rivers and mountains of China, and it is called loess. Loess. All right? So, in addition to the devastating floods, just like other places of the world, China, actually has a name for, as I showed you, these, as you can see, the rivers, they flood. Well, a lot of people, just like today, everywhere, live near water. They live near the rivers. And when these rivers would flood, it would cause widespread devastation throughout China. So there's a name for it. It's called China's sorrow. China's sorrow. Whenever the rivers would flood, and so that's just what it was called. China's sorrow. All right. Now, geographically, we said China is very, very large, very, very large. But how much of China do you think is good for growing stuff? Do you think it's fertile or not very fertile? How does that look? Does it look good for growing stuff? Not really, okay? Only about 10% of China is fertile. 10%. Compared to America, I don't know, you guys could probably go in your backyards and grow stuff. That's not so for a lot of Chinese people because their land is not suitable for farming. It's either too arid or not enough water. A variety of reasons. All right, so China is large. It's also very isolated, and you can see how this isolation is. This is a desert, okay? This large desert here above the plateau of Tibet, where the Himalayas are. Okay, so you got the Himalaya mountains right here. That's pretty tough to cross. So there's not going to be a lot of influx of people coming across the Himalayas. So let's say they come from the other direction, from the north or the west. And as you can see here, we have two deserts. Deserts are easy to cross, very difficult to cross as well. You also have the Pacific Ocean to the east. So the geography of China makes it very isolated. It keeps it safe from invaders. But unfortunately for the Chinese, they're constantly fighting with each other. Civil wars happen all the time. They even build walls to keep people out. One of them's pretty great. You know what that one is? The Great Wall of China. All right, very good. You feel all right? You need to go? Do you need to go to the office or anything?
No, I'm
okay.
Choking.
Okay. You want to get a water? Go get a water?
How would I do that?
I'll give you one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I play football, but I can't catch.
Yes, ma'am. You're welcome. Okay. So, questions on the geography of China. All right, so let's talk about the very first ever Chinese dynasty. It's called the Xia, Xia, Xia. And it was created by the picture, or the man whose picture this is on the left. And this first Chinese dynasty of Xia was created by you.
Oh, no.
Created by you. You created it. His name is you. Why you? You created it. Why you? A man named you. It's like, who's on first? All right. The way in which he was able to do this is he would have his peasant people, because they used feudalism, and I'll explain what that is toward the end of class. They irrigated the Yellow River, meaning they just built canals and dug ditches away from the river so that they took water to farmland that needed water. So that was then a large amount of people were able to live in one area because they were able to do systematic agriculture, which led to new settlements. And this irrigation was beneficial. More crops grow, more people grow, and there you go, the first civilization. And he handed his power down to who? Well, it's a dynasty, so who takes over when he dies? His son or someone in his family. So that's what makes a dynasty, where power is passed down from generation to generation. Now, the Shia dynasty does not last forever, but it was the first. It was, of course, as I mentioned, everybody always fighting with each other in ancient China. Lots of civil war. And they were later taken over by the Shang. You could also pronounce it Shang. And the Shang lasted a pretty long time, 1700 BC to 1027 BC. Now, you may have noticed that we did not have any dates for the Shia. That's because they didn't really leave very good records. It was not until the Shang that they actually left written records. And I have an example of their ancient Chinese writing. They were the first to use writing in China. The Shia did not have it. And if they did, we have no evidence of it. But we have evidence of the Shang using writing. So they are the first Chinese dynasty to leave written records that we are aware of. And when they take over the Shia, they're also taking over the irrigation and the canals. Yeah.
Do people still live in those homes?
Do they still live in those homes? Yeah, probably. I don't know if that's a real picture, or that might just be like a diorama, like a miniaturized thing. But yeah, this is just an example, a depiction of what a Chinese village might look like, an ancient Chinese village. And all of this, you see how crowded and congested it is? Why would they do it like that? Why did they feel like they needed to pack everybody in one place? Well, all of these people are protected by something. A wall. They built a wall all the way around it. And so it's much easier to build a wall over a smaller area. You don't want, the bigger the wall, the more expensive it is and the harder it is to maintain. And so that's why the space is at a premium, because everybody's crammed into the same space to keep safe behind the wall. And that's not uncommon for a lot of the ancient world. Everybody's crammed into one place to be safe because they wanted to be protected from invaders, and that's what the walls were able to do. All right, so that's the Shang dynasty. All right, the next part here is on Chinese culture. Culture and family is so very important to the ancient Chinese and the present day Chinese as well. A big aspect of Chinese culture is respect for your elders. Respect for your elders, especially your male elders. Especially male elders. In ancient Chinese culture, women were seen as inferior to men. And to a large extent, modern day Chinese culture as well. Women were seen as inferior to men. In fact, it was not always a joyous occasion when a woman would give birth to a baby girl. Whereas it would be celebration time if she gave birth to a baby boy. Women were not valued the way men were in ancient Chinese culture. So whenever a girl usually reached childbearing age, typically around the age of 13, her father would marry her to somebody else. They'd get married. Her father would arrange a marriage, and she would leave. This is the only way a woman could be seen as important in ancient Chinese culture. So it's very bad, and it's not right, but this is how it was in ancient China. The only way, and so once this woman is married, the only way that she can attain value for herself is by doing what? How can a woman be seen as having value? What kind of babies? That's right. Give birth to lots of boys, which is completely out of the woman's control. I mean, there's no way you can predict what kind of child you're going to have. So women really have it rough. They cannot do anything of their own merit to make them valuable or to be seen as valuable. Now, in our culture, of course, women are valuable. They're just as valuable as men, totally equal. But that is not the case in ancient China. The only way that they could be seen as important is if they provided their husband with several male children. All right, now, we said family is very important in ancient China, and religion is also very important in ancient China, and family and religion are linked. Family and religion were linked. They believe in ancestor worship, and that their ancestors could talk to the gods and goddesses, and that if they honored their ancestors well and lived appropriately and did things to make their ancestors happy, then their ancestors would bring them good luck and good fortune. Or, if they were dishonorable, if they did not honor their ancestors, if they forgot them, then their ancestors would bring disaster to them, or bad luck. So their ancestors demand attention. They demanded attention. Whether it be good attention or bad attention, they wanted to be remembered. And so you will see shrines, even in present day Chinese homes, dedicated to dead relatives, to honor them, to remember them, because they believe that through their ancestors they could communicate with the gods. Now, they did not believe that you just, say, hey, Grandma, I need some help. It wasn't like that. They had certain rituals that they performed in order to communicate with their ancestors, their dead ancestors. One such ritual involved the use of these things called oracle bones. Oracle bones. And here are some artifacts that we have found from ancient Chinese archaeological sites of oracle bones. Some of them are literally just bones, like animal bones. Others are tortoise shells. Tortoise shells, like the one on the right is a tortoise shell. And what they do is if you are a person who has a question, or you want to talk to one of your ancestors, you take an oracle bone and you scratch the question on there. You engrave it. You with a needle or some sharp metal object, and you engrave the question on the oracle bone or on the tortoise shell, whichever you have. Either was fine. If you did not know how to read, you would go to a Chinese priest who would scratch the question on there. So once you get the questions scratched on the bone or the tortoise shell, then you go to the Chinese priest who will look at your question and then offer this as a sacrifice to the gods or to your ancestors. And then he would begin the process of heating up the oracle bone, usually by taking a hot metal rod and inserting it in the bone until it cracks and breaks, or the tortoise shell, putting it in a fire until it cracks and breaks. And then, once it cools, the priest will look at the breaks and the cracks in the bone and interpret an answer for you. So that's how they would communicate. You have a question, you get an answer. Literally, not like a prayer and maybe you interpret it as you go to the priest with a question, you leave there with an answer. And the process by which they did that is through these oracle bones. Oracle bones. All right? So that's just how their religion worked. That's how their religion worked. So, but honor was a very important aspect, and honoring your dead relatives is still very important in ancient Chinese culture and present day Chinese culture. Okay? So, question on that? Okay. Here's another example of Chinese writing. Now, written language was universal throughout China. And many people could read this Chinese writing, but the dialects were different. They may speak different languages, but the writing is the same. The writing was universal, but the spoken languages were not. So many people could read this, but not be able to say it out loud so that everybody could understand it. It sounds kind of weird to us. Like, we see English, we read it, we say it out loud, we all understand it because we speak English. That was not the case in ancient China. Many different dialects emerged, even though the writing was universal. All right? So, spoken languages were different all throughout China. And you guys think it was tough to learn to read English. There were over 1,500 characters that had to be memorized just to be barely literate. So to be like, a kindergartner, first grader, you'd have to memorize 1,500 characters to be barely literate, just be able to function. Right? Like, see a sign that says bathroom and know that's the bathroom. Okay? 1,500 individual characters. Their writing is not an alphabet where you take different letters and make words. They're pictographs. Each symbol has a meaning. And there were 1,500 just to be barely literate. If you wanted to be a scholar or a person of education, you had to know over 10,000 symbols. 10,000 symbols just to be able to be a good reader or good writer. 10,000. That being said, noblemen were the only people that were very literate. Peasants didn't even learn to read. So a very small portion of the population in ancient China could read or write. And it was usually among the wealthier classes of people. All right? But it looks cool. Isn't that some cool looking writing? That's ancient Chinese pictographs. Pictographs is what those are called. They're not hieroglyphs, they're pictographs. It's a little different. All right. The next dynasty that takes over after the Shang or Shang is the Zhou dynasty. Z-H-O-U, the Zhou dynasty. They overthrew the Shang in 1027 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. Now, the Zhou institute a new way of doing their dynasty. They kind of changed one of the aspects of their religion. And the change that they instill is called the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven. So this means that it is the responsibility of the king to protect everything. And if his people are safe, if no natural disasters occur, if things are going good in the natural world, then the ancestors and the gods are pleased with the king's performance. But if an earthquake happens, a flood, a tsunami, a typhoon, that would indicate that the king has lost the God's favor, has lost the mandate of heaven, and therefore needs to be replaced. So it's a cycle. We call this the dynastic cycle. And it works like this. A new king takes over, and everybody's happy, everybody's pumped, things are good. New king, new sheriff in town. Things are going to change, things are going to be better. And for a while, there is peace. People are happy. People are happy. There is peace. Time that goes on, and corruption begins to sneak in as the king only, helps out his own family members. As the king discovers just how wealthy he is, and will live an absolute life of luxury while his people starve to death. You know, some of these dynastic kings in the zoo were like they would bathe in milk. Milk. Like, imagine how much milk it takes to fill up a tub. Oh, no sleeping allowed. Okay? It'll help your grade too. All right, so imagine that, taking a bath in milk every day. How expensive is that? Whereas other people are literally starving to death. And this guy's taking a bath in milk. So, corruption and carefree, not caring about the peasant class. And then more time passes, and ultimately a natural disaster is going to occur. Is it the emperor or the king's fault that an earthquake happens? Is it the king's fault that the river floods?
No.
We know now, probably not. But the ancient Chinese said that it's his fault. He has angered the gods. And so when this happens, everybody that the king rules thinks that he should be replaced because he's lost the mandate of heaven. He has lost the favor of the gods. So who's going to take over? How do you think that process works? Well, I'm a pretty wealthy guy. And so I'll take all my people and all my family, and I'll take all my money, and I'll pay a bunch of peasants, and we're gonna show up, and we're gonna try to overthrow them. But Sydney, she's got wet money too, and so she pays a bunch of peasants where she lives, and she's gonna go try to overthrow them. And so we all go to the capital, and what do? It's a big free-for-all battle. Every 20, 30, 40 years, it's a civil war breaking out, and whoever wins becomes the new emperor, becomes the new king. So and it's a cycle. So Sydney's family ends up winning, and so now Sydney's the new king of China. So now a new dynasty has began. Things are good, and then Sydney starts taking baths of milk, and more corruption, and then natural disaster. It happens all over again. This is why ancient China was such a violent place. The nature of the dynastic cycle. And those are some of the effects. Okay? So it was the king's duty to rule properly and keep the gods pleased in order to prevent natural disasters. If the king failed to do so, he would be overthrown. That's what caused the dynastic cycle to form. All right? You'll be expected to know how the dynastic cycle works. New dynasty, time passes, corruption, natural disaster, king loses mandate of heaven, civil war, new dynasty. Over and over and over again. Okay? All right. Last little bit is on Chinese feudalism. Feudalism. Feudalism it's political, it's economic, and it's social. It's a system that governs all of those different aspects of society. In America, what is our political system? Starts with a D. Democracy. What is our economic system? Capitalism. All right? And then in society, where you stand in society depends upon what? How much money you have. You know, if you're upper class, you got a lot of money. If you're poor, you're at the lower class. That is the structure of our society. Feudalism is all of those in one. It incorporates all of those in one. Whereas in America, we have three separate things that define those. In China, feudalism is all in one. So this is how it worked. Like nobles, rich people, the way in which you became wealthy is by ownership of land. Land ownership made you wealthy. So if you owned land, you owed allegiance to the king. So you provide the king with tax money and loyalty. And then all that land that you have, people live on it. They don't own the land. They just work on it. Those people are peasants. All right? So you have a very few amount of wealthy landowning nobles and a large amount of poor peasants who own nothing. So, I own the land, and all the people that work on it, I have to protect them. I provide them with military service. So I become like, a samurai, or I become like a warrior of some kind, and I protect them. And all the other nobles, they help protect all the nobles are the military people. All the peasants, they just farm. Okay? So, in return for me protecting them, they have to be loyal to me and provide me with taxes and crops and loyalty. They have to give me those things so that I can then give it to the king. So it's almost like I rule them and the king rules me. They're at the bottom, I'm wealthy, and then the king's at the top. So you got wealthy people, or you get the king, wealthy nobles, peasants. With about 95% of the population in which group? Peasants. All right? So that's just kind of how it works. So your nobles are your military. You would have a merchant class in there as well, who live in cities or towns who don't really do farming, but they would be like a slight step up from farmers. They are still not, unless they're super wealthy merchants, then they would not be considered noblemen. Okay? Questions on feudalism or ancient China? Oh, I know it's kind of fast. Okay. So remember, you have a vocabulary quiz on Monday. It's pretty large, so you better study. And then a test on Wednesday. Tuesday, you'll have a study guide. And tomorrow we'll do the activities for Module 2, Section 5. And I'll have everything for next week on Schoology by the end of my school day tomorrow. And if you ever have questions, don't hesitate to ask me from today.